Hi, hello, everybody. Welcome to the lightning talk on transport and decarbonization in the context of the Infra for Development conference. My name is Cecilia Briceño Garmendia. I'm the Global Lead for Transport Economics at the World Bank, and I will be moderating this session. What we have heard so far in this very interesting day is that transport is at the forefront of the ongoing global crisis of climate change, and that no scenario for achieving the 2-degree target is feasible without decarbonizing transport. We know that transport emits 25% of global emission, and these emissions are predicted to increase. And the problem gets compounded, but world population projected to reach 8.5 billion by 2030. So this challenge is increasing in complexity as we grow, is complex in nature given the characteristics of transport. We have even growing a middle class and rapid urbanization that complicates the problems. So that sets the importance of the 6 presentations we are going to have today. In today's session, we are bringing 6 top academic panelists. They will be discussing their research and findings on how transport interventions can have big potential impact on decarbonization and the carbon footprint of the sector. The 6 panelists will be presenting in a two-part session that will have in the middle short spaces for question and answers. We'll ask all the participants to present your questions in the box of question and answers that you have in your application. And then my colleague Mathilde Lebrun will be collecting them and will be voicing them for the panelists. So the 2 parts of the sessions is start with Professor Tivra Garv from the University of California, San Diego, and Professor Andres Gomez Lobo from University of Chile. They will be talking about investment interventions very much anchored in physical investments with important impact on the urban spaces and the inertia of spaces in general. I'll stop here and I'll let Professor Tivra Garv and Professor Andres Gomez Lobos to please kindly go ahead with your presentations. Tivra, please go ahead. We cannot hear you, Tivra. You might need to unmute.
Okay, thank you, Cecilia. I'm going to start by talking about what is perhaps not immediately considered a direct effect of transportation infrastructure in the context of decarbonization. And I'm going to focus on how transport infrastructure is related to land use change and particularly to forest cover. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to come from joint work with Sam Asher and Paul Novosad. So the background of this research really comes from the fact that about 16 million miles of roads are going to be built over the next 30 years. And this represents about 60% increase compared to 2010 levels. Now, 9 out of 10 of these roads are going to be built in developing countries. And many of these are where we still see the last stands of tropical forests. Why are tropical forests important from a standpoint of decarbonization? It's because deforestation contributes to about 10 to 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is because both the both the ability of forests to take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store that carbon, but also that when deforestation does occur, there is a release of that stored carbon back into the atmosphere. So if we can curb deforestation, we can make significant progress in our goals towards decarbonization. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the link between transportation infrastructure and deforestation. The effects of roads on forest cover are theoretically ambiguous. There has been a long line of research on this, and a number of different possible explanations have been proposed. These range from changes in relative returns to agriculture, so you can have people moving in and out of agriculture, or intensification versus extensification. At a simplest level, you can see a lowering of transportation costs for timber. You can also think about changes in fuel use, and there's a number of other possibilities, but the idea is that theoretically these effects are going to be ambiguous. The challenge has been that it's very difficult to think about the causal effects of roads in this context because of the endogenous placement of roads. We don't go around placing roads randomly, we build them in a very deliberate manner, and so figuring out a credible research design has been challenging. So what we do is we consider two of India's signature road development programs. The first was a rural roads program where roads were allocated to villages as sort of last mile roads based on a population cutoff, giving us a regression discontinuity design that I will show you. And the second will be the expansion of highways in India. So there were two major corridors, the north-south, east-west corridors, as well as the Golden Quadrilateral that connected major cities in India. And massive expansion of these highways took place. And we're going to use a difference in differences design by comparing locations close and further away before and after the upgradation of these roads. So the two results that we're going to show you is the first is that this population threshold did matter for the probability of getting a road. So you see this big jump up in the likelihood that someone's going to get a village is going to get a road around this population cutoff, but that there was actually no effect of building these rural roads on forest cover. You're going to notice that that is continuous around the population threshold. And we did a number of different checks to make sure that these weren't driven by differences across locations, et cetera. In general, there is no effect of rural roads on forest cover. By contrast, highways reduced forest cover by about 17%. So in this picture, you'll see that as you go down the pictures over, as you go down the lines and the curves, you're going to see a effect of deforestation over the years as the Golden Quadrilateral project comes into place. There's a delayed onset with the north, south, east, west corridor, which is of course consistent with what we know about the delayed onset of that road building program in and of itself. So both of these programs tell us that there's about a 17% effect of highway expansion on forest cover. Now, why do rural roads matter, not affect forest cover, but highways do? In the case of highways, we see that a lot of this is driven by the expansion of the forest industry. So by comparing employment in logging firms and wood using firms, these are two characteristics in the economic census of India, we see that after the construction of highways, there is a dramatic increase in employment in these firms, which is a proxy, of course, for activity happening within these firms. The reason we think that these differences exist is because highways are essentially providing corridors for transportation of timber, lowering those timber costs, and therefore leading to an expansion of these industries. Whereas in the case of rural roads, what we know to be true is that most of the effect of rural roads is in leading to exits out of agriculture, allowing individuals to seek jobs elsewhere, and those exits out of agriculture don't end up impacting forest cover in any substantial way. So to conclude, like I mentioned, there's going to be a lot of road activity, and a lot of these places are going to have a ton of forest cover. The effects of these roads are going to be quite heterogeneous. Rural roads have no effect on forest cover, despite leading to exits from agriculture. These highway expansions do reduce forest cover. If we think about how do we quantify the social cost of carbon? If we think of this as just accelerated deforestation, that is that highways are causing deforestation just faster, but that would have occurred anyways, then this is about 25% of the fiscal cost. If we think of this deforestation as additional, that this is new deforestation and not simply an acceleration of the deforestation, then we think of these as this is going to be about 100% of the fiscal cost. Now, the point of this is not to say that we should not build highways in any way. That's not at all what we're talking about. All we're saying is that when we're building transportation infrastructure, we do need to think about and include in our cost benefit calculations the ecological cost, which is quite important from a decarbonization standpoint. And of course, the importance of this work, I think, is quite valid in the sense that there's going to be a dramatic expansion of the kinds of infrastructure improvements that we're studying here across the world. So with that, I will turn it back to Cecilia. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This was perfectly on time. And it's very interesting to see how these investment decisions, you're linking the investment decisions on the effect on the environment and the inertia that we can create, and the trade-off presented between the economic activity that we generate and the cost, let those be financial or ecological, that are linked to that decision. But that takes us to another very important intervention that Professor Andrés Gómez-Lobos will discuss, which is related to public transportation. And that is very much linked on how we use spaces in cities, how we make decisions on that. And for that, I will open the floor to Professor Gómez-Lobos. Professor Gómez-Lobos, please.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about actually two issues, recent research that I've undertaken. One is the promotion of public transport. Any viable strategy to reduce the carbon footprint in transport must, I believe, promote mobile share from unsustainable private motorized modes to sustainable modes, including public transport or transit. This by itself, the shift will reduce carbon emissions, but also it's easier to introduce new technology, low emission technology in transit, as has been the case in Latin America, in Santiago and Bogota, also Mexico City with electric buses. Now, Latin America has been a pioneer in transit reform since Curitiba in Brazil in the 70s, and also the well-known reform of Transmilenio in Bogota in the year 2000. And this has inspired many reforms around the world and in Latin America in particular. And the question I want to try to address is, have they worked? And I will analyze one case in Colombia in that respect. And the second issue I want to talk about is ride-hailing application, whether they help or hinder the prospect for a more sustainable transport sector. So following the success of Transmilenio, Colombia implemented a series of reforms in intermediate cities between 2006 and 2016 in Barranquilla, Bucaramanga, Cartagena, and other cities. These were gold standard BRT reforms, and I use a difference in difference approach to analyze the effect of these reforms on ridership. And the results, here I have an example of Bucaramanga. The reform was around the year 2010. Actually, it was in December of 2009. And we can see there's a sharp drop in ridership around the time of the reform. And on average, my results indicate that reforms reduced ridership between 9 and 12% across the different cities. So this is quite a negative result. And why did this happen? The hypothesis is that these reforms were costly. They implied labor formalization, high standard vehicles, electronic prepayment systems, fleet management technology, infrastructure. And fares could not be increased, nor were there any public subsidies initially contemplated for this reform. And so the only adjustment variable to make income equal cost was fleet size. And fleet size was decreased, which affected coverage and frequency, which in turn increased users' time cost and decreased the ride experience. There was a quality deterioration. And this had an impact on transit use. And there's anecdotal evidence that users switched to less sustainable modes, such as cars, motorcycles, or motor taxis with a higher footprint. So it's not good news. They also generated financial problems for all of these reforms. Now, what I have shown for the SITM reforms in Colombia applies to many other reforms in Latin America, including Transantiago in Santiago, Chile, SITP reforms in Bogota, MIBUS in Panama City, and many other reforms in Mexico, Peru, and others. So therefore, the success of Transmilenio, unfortunately, has not been replicated in other Latin American experiences. And so the environmental benefits of transit reforms that promote the use of public transport have not materialized. On the contrary, it would seem that as far as environmental benefits are concerned, these reforms were counterproductive. So we need to urgently rethink transit reforms in Latin America and possibly other countries in other cities in the world. The second issue that I've been analyzing or researching is the effect of ride-hailing applications. And this is joint work with Alejandro Tiracini, also from the University of Chile. And what we did is we did a Monte Carlo simulation of the effects of ride-hailing applications on the total vehicle kilometers in trips, total vehicle kilometer trips, taking a series of parameters such as passenger occupational rates, non-passenger, for example, how many kilometers without passengers do taxis run compared to ride-hailing applications, many other parameters. And the results we obtained was that it's very unlikely that high ride-hailing applications will reduce vehicle kilometer trips unless passenger occupation increases substantially from the levels we're seeing right now. And the reason for this is not hard to find. If you look at a series of surveys, you can see when people answer the question of what mode they would have chosen if the ride-hailing application was not available, a substantial amount of passengers would have used public transport, bicycle, walking, or would not have taken the trip. So what we're seeing is quite a lot of passengers being siphoned off from sustainable and efficient modes to less sustainable ride-hailing services. So this is where all the results come about, that basically people that would otherwise use public transport, bicycle, walking, or would not have made the trip are using ride-hailing applications. The last column is very interesting because it's the only representative sample I know of. The others are intercept samples or taken from social media. So the conclusion for ride-hailing is that it's very unlikely that ride-hailing application will reduce aggregate vehicle kilometers traveled. They most probably increase these vehicle kilometer travel. And this has a negative impact on congestion depending on the time of day of that travel, and also on emissions, insofar as you're having a modal switch from public transport or sustainable modes such as walking and bicycle to private cars. Basically, ride-hailing applications use private motorized vehicles. And the policy implications for this is, well, whether to consider to include a tax on ride-hailing services, as already occurs in certain cities such as Sao Paulo, Mexico City. The case of Sao Paulo is very interesting because in principle, the idea was to include a charge depending on the congestion situation of the city. So therefore, I think I've completed my 7 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Gomez Lobo. It's very interesting to see in your presentation that success is not guaranteed, okay? In any case, not because we are going for a public transportation mode or because micromobility or ride-hailing is an option, that necessarily implies that the cities and the populations will benefit in terms of decarbonization, actually, and in terms of, if I understood you correctly, other type of potential benefits in terms of adoption of technologies and efficiency. So access and making sure that in the case of ride-hailing, access to the applications and an option that creates multimodality is in place are key factors. But with that, I would like to open it for a few minutes to questions, and I will ask my colleague Mathilde to raise any questions that is in the box, in the inbox.
So there is one question in the Q&A box. Please write your questions in the Q&A if you have some more questions for this session. So let me read the first question. So it sounds like the highways were built for the purpose of lowering the cost of the timber industries. Does the ecological cost matter to policymakers if the purpose is to extract forest for products? So this is a question for the first presenter.
Yeah, thank you, Reagan, for that question. So I don't think it's fair to say that the explicit purpose of the policy was to lower timber costs. I think the expansion of highways, I don't think in any of the documentation that proposed it, there was any discussion about like lowering the timber costs. I can't say that for sure, but I'm fairly confident about that. So I don't think that this is something that the policymakers necessarily intended. So we would think of this as one of the unintended consequences, is this expansion in deforestation. And that's precisely the point that we're making, which is that just because they're unintended doesn't mean that these ecological costs don't exist. And especially as decarbonization takes center space, as we think about nationwide, national level commitments to the Paris Treaty, to the Paris Agreement, I think that there is, this is one other area where we can see major gains in achieving our goals towards decarbonization. So the point is, include these ecological costs in your cost benefit analysis, especially when they differ across the types of infrastructure.
Thank you. So there are a lot of questions that just arrived. So two questions for the second presenter. So the first one from Vivian Foster. Is there any role for regulating number of riders on shared ride-hailing applications? And the second question from Arturo Ardila. What is the role of frequency of bus service in the cases you analyzed and recommendations for future reforms? And maybe a last question from George Darido. What types of transit reforms do you recommend for informal operators to ensure public benefits? So this is for the second presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I heard the first question, but the other two, I couldn't hear it. Could you repeat them, please?
Yeah, so second question, is the role of frequency of bus service in the cases you analyzed and recommendations for future reforms? And the last question is, what types of transit reforms do you recommend for informal operators to ensure public benefits?
Thank you. As for the first question, I do not know of any regulation on the number of riders or occupational rates for ride-hailing application. I think that would be very hard to do. Unless you have these services which are pooled services. Perhaps if you promote pooled services such as Uber Pool, for example, and disincentivize through some type of regulation or pricing mechanism individual rides, that may help. But I do not know of any regulatory experience that forces the number of that regulates the number of riders in a given ride-hailing application. As for transit reforms, frequency decreased, and that has an impact on ridership. So future reforms have to look very carefully at what is the impact of reform on users' time costs. What is the perception? What is my impression is that many reforms in Latin America have been undertaken because policymakers want a modern system, but they haven't looked at what is the impact on the user's experience and cost, including time cost. So you have, for example, transfer cost. If you have a feeder system and you have to change your trunk system, that's costly for users. So my recommendation would be to look at users' cost in any reform before going forward. And the second would be to look at infrastructure, which goes to the third question about informal operators. I think there are successful experiences in Latin America, particularly in Buenos Aires. I'm quite fond of the experience in Buenos Aires of building open corridors, not gold standard BRT corridors, but just open corridors where informal or formal buses go in, they go very quickly, and then they leave and they go to their different feeder areas without users having to transfer between services. And so I would look more at low cost, non-gold standard BRT infrastructure investments as a way forward.
Excellent. Can you? I think hopefully we'll have more time at the end of the session. If you want more questions with the panelists, otherwise we'll have the chat open so you can have exchange with the panelists. But with that, we want to move to the second part of the lightning sessions. And that second part will focus on behavioral issues. We heard earlier from Professor Grube that the low carbon infrastructure is not more expensive than high carbon infrastructure. But what really matters and makes the difference is the path and the process, the why and the behavioral aspects. And on that, we know that car ownership is in the rise. And the use of private cars is competing with other type of modes. So for the second part, we are going to have 4 panelists from academics. Joanna Lin is Moody. I'm sorry, I'm combining the names, apologies for that. Joanna Moody is from the Mobility Systems Cert in MIT, and she's going to talk about the use of private cars and the links to the cultural, the pride and cultural aspects. And then we are going to have Josh Lin talking about the use of policies, particularly taxations on fuels, to have behavioral intended consequences. And Fang from the World Bank, Fang San, is going to talk about the incentives, let those be taxes or physical in terms of use of spaces to promote adoption of e-mobilities. And finally, last but not least, we're going to have Kilian Hellman talking about digital technologies and their use for decarbonizing the trucking sector. And with that, I'll give the floor to Joanna. Please, Joanna, take over.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for the introduction, and I'm hoping that everyone can see my slides and hear me clearly. So I'm going to talk about the need to reinvent the car, and I'm going to introduce one sort of way in which we often think about this on a technology perspective, and then I'm going to also provide more of a cultural or sort of social science perspective to this same question. And really a lot of this work is premised on the fact that use of single occupancy internal combustion engine vehicles is one of the greatest contributors to negative impacts of urban mobility systems, and that includes congestion, road safety, air pollution, and social exclusion. And so to be sustainable, we really have to reinvent the car. And we often hear about these 3 revolutions as technological ways that we might reinvent the car. We might think of electrifying it and making it greener. We might think about the sharing economy and how that might make things more efficient and expand access to vehicular travel to those who don't have access now. And then automation and connectivity, which has a range of potential benefits, but really safety is one of the key aspects there. And I'm actually going to just quickly touch on the technology perspective and follow up really nicely on what Professor Gomez-Lobo talked about in terms of ride hailing and discuss the fact that we really need to think about the sharing economy as 2 different potential revolutions. And one of them is just the fact of on-demand service, and that is you can hail a car, and that's the sharing of the vehicle itself as an asset. And the other is pooling. And that's when you match multiple trips to the same vehicle, and what you're sharing is the trip itself. And these have very different implications for particularly VMT or VKT and congestion. And so one of the things that he and his colleagues have looked at is the importance of increasing the occupancy rate within some of these ride-hailing systems. And I'm going to dive into this issue of exclusive versus pooled ride-hailing. And again, by exclusive, I mean the equivalent of UberX, where you call a car and it only serves your trip. And by pooled, I'm going to talk about a trip where I may ask for a car, and then I also get paired with someone else that I don't know who's making a trip that is somehow compatible in space and time. And so Professor Gomez-Lobo produced some numbers that were aggregate. How do people use ride hailing? What modes do they substitute? And I'm going to show you some numbers that are disaggregated by the type of ride hailing service. So we're going to see exclusive service, or that UberX equivalent, in purple and the pooled service in yellow. And first we're going to look at Singapore, which is a dense, wealthy city. It has robust formal public transit networks. And here we're going to see that exclusive and pooled ride hailing interact very differently with incumbent modes. So exclusive ride hailing is much more often replacing private motorized forms of transport like personal car, motorcycle, and taxi. It's also more likely to induce demand. On the other hand, pooled ride hailing is more often replacing the sustainable alternatives, including public transit and walking and biking. And so this is a big question mark for those who think that what we need to do is just encourage pooling within ride hailing systems. Well, right now, those who are pooling are those that are coming from public transit, walking and biking more than those who are not pooling. And then we also see that these are not actually mutually exclusive. So those who, if pooling weren't available, a lot of people might pay more to take an exclusive trip, but the opposite is not true. And so these are really seen as different travel alternatives by people, and they cater to different types of trips. And so we do need to be thinking about these as potentially separate technological solutions and travel options for consumers. And then we're also going to look at this in 3 cities in Mexico. These are 3 cities with a very different context to Singapore. Most of the public transport is provided by minibus taxi. There is no formal rail system. And we see a less marked difference in what modes each type of service is replacing. Although we do see a slightly higher rate of substitution of motorized modes by exclusive ride hailing rather than pooled, but we also see a much higher substitutability between the 2 forms of ride hailing. And we have some more qualitative work that I won't get into here that sort of looks at what are some of the key trade-offs that people consider when thinking about whether to use an exclusive or a pooled version of these. But a lot of my work also looks at how can we reinvent the car from a non-technology perspective. So this is, again, under this premise that technology alone is not going to bring about the reinvention of the car at the scale or pace necessary to accomplish our sustainable urban mobility goals. And that we need attitude and behavior shift among consumers, that has to be shaped by policy. And in order to inform that policy and inform that attitude and behavior shift, we have to identify what is it about cars that makes people want them, makes people take them, and what is it about cars beyond just the travel time and travel cost on a trip-by-trip basis. And so I've done some work looking at car pride, which I define as the attribution of social status and personal image. These are 2 facets of pride in the social science literature, and how that's attributed to both car ownership and car use. And this is done using a survey measure which has 12 statements, things like, others would see me as more effective if I owned more cars, or I gain respect from my peers because I drive a car. And people respond to these on a 7-point Likert scale, so from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And from these 12 statements, we can derive a measure of each individual's car pride, and then we can understand how that interacts with their actual car consumption, their car ownership, and their car use behavior. And what we find is that car pride strongly predicts car ownership. So if I have more car pride as an individual, I'm much more likely to purchase a vehicle. Once I own that vehicle, I'm much more likely to use it. And that actually, the more I use my vehicle, the stronger my symbolic attachment to that vehicle is, and the stronger my car pride is. So we have a very strong reinforcing cycle here between attitude and behavior. And that is at the individual level. And then we also want to look at how can we measure car pride across countries to really understand motorization trends and potential implications for the future. And across countries, we find that developing countries, that's in the green, with less mature vehicle markets, but greater road vehicle use, report higher values of car pride after controlling for the types of individuals living in these different countries. And so we'll see here, I'm just going to highlight a few. Here is Japan at the lowest car pride. Here are a number of European developed countries, Austria, Switzerland, Spain, Norway. This lovely lone purple dot here is the United States. We are the highest car pride developed country within the sample, but potentially most impactful is this group of countries here that have really high car pride. And these are countries in Southeast Asia and Middle East and North Africa, and also Kenya here, where we see these are really rapidly motorizing countries, or countries where we expect a lot of vehicle growth. We're also seeing high levels of car pride.
Joanna, you might be, you have 30 seconds.
Great.
Roughly to wrap up. Yes.
So just the takeaways here are that technology alone will not reinvent the car at the scale or pace necessary to combat climate change. And sustainable transport is in a marketing war with the car, and it is losing by not engaging in branding and understanding how we can better connect the services that we provide with the needs, both tangible and more symbolic, of consumers. And so cars are an aspirational good. We need to understand the multiple entry points that can maybe break this cycle of attitude and behavior reinforcement in car consumption before it creates an established paradigm, particularly in some of these rapidly motorizing countries. So with that, I will pause and let the next speaker take over.
Thank you, Joanna. This is very interesting. Talking about how to break that circle of car pride, car ownership and use. Well, we say if you cannot go against it, go with it.